I was 14 the first time I realized that the world could decide who I was before I even had the chance to introduce myself. It happened at the mall, a place I had been dozens of times with my friends, laughing, running in and out of stores the way teenagers do. But that day was different. That day I went alone. I was looking at sneakers, debating whether I could convince my mom to buy me a pair when I felt it, the weight of someone watching me. I turned, saw a security guard standing by the entrance, arms crossed, eyes locked on me. I glanced around. There were other kids in the store, some white, some Latino, all of them picking up shoes, trying them on, joking with the employees, but the guard wasn't watching them. Just me. At first I ignored it, moved to another aisle, picked up a different pair, but he followed, not moving, just watching. I felt my chest tighten, an uncomfortable heat creeping up my neck. I wasn't doing anything wrong, but suddenly I felt like I was. I put the shoes back, stepped toward the door, and that's when he spoke. "You gonna buy something or just look?" The words hit me like a slap. I had money in my pocket. I had planned to buy something, but now I felt small. My voice caught in my throat. I glanced around again, but no one said anything. The cashier kept ringing up sales. The other kids kept browsing, as if none of it was happening. I walked out of the store without buying anything, without looking back. When I got home, I told my mom. She sighed, rubbed her temples, but didn't look surprised. She just said, "Welcome to the world." I didn't understand what she meant, not fully, but I would soon. By the time I was 16, I had learned the rules: how to keep my hands visible in stores, how not to linger too long in one place, how to smile just enough to seem non-threatening, but not too much to seem suspicious, how to shrink myself so that I wouldn't be seen as a problem. But none of it mattered. One night after a football game, my friends and I stopped at a gas station to get snacks. We were laughing about something stupid, the way teenagers do. When a police car pulled up, the officer got out, walked straight toward me. "What are you boys doing here?" We looked at each other, confused. "Buying snacks," I said, holding up the bottle of Gatorade I had just grabbed. The officer didn't smile. He looked me up and down, then nodded toward the parking lot. "You drive?" "No, sir," I said. "Das?" My friend David, who was white, stepped forward. "I do, officer. Is there a problem?" The officer studied him, then me, then the rest of my friends, some white, some black, some Latino. His eyes settled on me. "We've got a call about some kids causing trouble, just making sure you're not one of them." I felt my stomach drop. David frowned but didn't say anything, and I knew why, because we had all heard the stories, because we had all seen the news, because we knew how these things could go. The officer nodded, gave me one last look, then walked back to his car. We stood there silent until he drove off. That night when I got home, I asked my mom if she had ever felt like this, like no matter what she did, she would always be seen as something she wasn't. She just gave me a tired smile and said, "Baby, I've been feeling like that my whole life." When I got to college, I thought things would change, that I would finally be seen for who I was and not what I looked like. But racism doesn't disappear, it just changes shape. Freshman year, I walked into my political science class early. The professor was setting up his slides. He looked up when I entered and said, "Oh, sorry, tutoring doesn't start until after class." I blinked, confused, until I realized what he meant. He thought I was a tutor. He thought I wasn't supposed to be there. I sat down in the front row, met his eyes, and said, "I'm in your class." He cleared his throat, muttered something about an honest mistake, but I saw the way his face flushed. I saw the way he avoided my gaze for the rest of the semester. It didn't stop there. Job interviews where my name made people pause before shaking my hand. Security following me through high-extend stores. People assuming I was an athlete before a student. Women clutching their purses tighter when I walked by. It was everywhere, subtle and loud all at once. Then one night it wasn't subtle at all. I was driving back from a friend's house late, music low, windows cracked, just enjoying the quiet. When I saw the flashing lights in my rearview mirror, my hands went cold. My breath caught, but I pulled over, rolled down the window, kept my hands on the wheel like I had been taught since I was a kid. The officer walked up, shined his flashlight in my face, license and registration. I handed them over. He glanced at them, then at me. "Where are you headed?" "Home, sir." He studied me a moment. "Too long. You've been drinking." "No, sir." He nodded as if he didn't believe me, looked in the back seat, then back at me. "Step out of the car." My stomach twisted, my legs felt heavy, but I did what I was told because I knew better, because I knew what could happen if I didn't. He patted me down, checked my car, asked me the same questions again and again, as if waiting for me to slip up. Finally, he handed me my license back. "Drive safe." I got in my car, closed the door, and sat there gripping the wheel, staring at the streetlights, my heart pounding in my chest. I drove home in silence, parked in the driveway, and let my head fall against the steering wheel. I wasn't sure if I wanted to cry or scream or both. The next morning I told my mom. She nodded like she had been waiting for it, like she knew it was only a matter of time. "Welcome to the world," she said again. But this time I understood exactly what she meant. I thought that after college, after getting a degree, after proving myself in every possible way, that I wouldn't have to keep explaining my existence, that my name, my skin, my presence in a room wouldn't always be something to question, but life has a way of reminding you that no matter how much you achieve, you are always one moment away from being seen as less. It started with a job interview, the kind I had worked my whole life for, the kind I had dreamed about. My resume was strong, my experience solid. I had prepared for weeks. When I walked into the office building, I felt good, confident, ready, but the receptionist barely looked at me when I gave my name. She glanced at the computer, then back at me, her eyebrows pulled together like something didn't add up. "You're here for the janitor position, right?" My stomach dropped, but I kept my face calm. "No, I'm here for the analyst position." Her mouth opened, then closed. She glanced at the computer again, then forced a smile. "Oh, right, have a seat. Someone will be with you shortly." I sat in the lobby, my jaw tight, hands gripping my resume so hard the paper crumpled when they finally called me in. I shook hands with the hiring manager, a white man in his 40s, who smiled just a little too much, who asked me questions that felt just a little too careful. "So where are you from originally?" I smiled tight and said, "Here." He nodded like he didn't believe me. When the interview ended, I knew I wouldn't get the job. I could see it in his eyes, the way he thanked me for coming in, but never said, "We'll be in touch." A week later, I got the email, "We've decided to move forward with another candidate. Thank you for your time." I stared at the screen, my chest tight. A month later, I saw who got the job. A man who had less experience than me, a man who had once asked me for help with his assignments back in college, a man whose name and skin made things easier for him. I told myself to move on, to keep applying, to keep pushing forward, because that's what I had been taught to do. 2 months later, I got an offer at a different firm. The pay was decent, the position was good. I told myself it was a win, but the first week on the job reminded me that winning is never as simple as it seems. I was the only black person in my department, the only one who had to prove over and over again that I belonged. In meetings I spoke and people nodded but barely acknowledged what I said until someone else repeated it. In the break room, I watched as my coworkers laughed, joked together, but when I walked in, the energy shifted slightly. The conversation slowed, not in a hostile way, but in a way that reminded me I was different. Then one afternoon, I walked into the office kitchen to grab coffee and found 2 co-workers whispering about something. They stopped when they saw me, exchange glances, then one of them laughed nervously. We were just talking about how diversity is so important. You must feel really proud to be here. I smiled politely, but inside I felt my stomach twist. Later that week, my manager pulled me aside and told me that my work was good, but I should try to be more of a team player, that I should engage more socially, that I should make people feel more comfortable around me. I wanted to ask him if anyone else had been given that advice, if anyone else had been told that their presence made people uneasy. But I didn't, because I already knew the answer. I tried to shake it off, to remind myself that I was here because I deserved to be, but then one night everything became clear. I was staying late finishing up a report when I heard my name coming from the conference room. I walked past the door and stopped, just out of sight, listening. I don't know, he's good, but you know how it is. What do you mean? I mean, we have to be careful with these hires. HR is watching this stuff closely. We can't make it look like we're not giving people a chance. There was a pause, then laughter. Well, at least this one seemed smart. I stood there, my fingers curled into fists, the words washing over me like cold water. I had always known, but hearing it out loud was different. Hearing it confirmed that no matter how hard I worked, I would always be the hire. They had to be careful about the person, they had to tolerate the risk, they had to manage. I walked out of the office that night, sat in my car for a long time staring at the city lights, wondering if it was worth it, if all of this was ever going to be enough. That night I called my mother, told her what happened. She sighed the same sigh she had always sighed and said what she had always said. I know, baby, but you can't let them see you break. I took a breath, nodded even though she couldn't see me, and said, I won't. But I wasn't sure if I believed it anymore. David Carter had never felt more out of place. The polished floors of the country club gleamed under the soft lighting, the quiet murmur of conversation rolling through the air like an unseen current. He adjusted the cuffs of his suit jacket, forcing himself to stand tall as he walked past tables of men in tailored blazers and women in pearls. The waitstaff, all black and Hispanic, moved swiftly between guests, silent and unnoticed. He had been here before, plenty of times in fact, but never as a member. Tonight's was different. Tonight he was the guest of honor. The invitation had arrived 2 weeks ago, handwritten on heavy cardstock, embossed with gold lettering. The Heritage Club cordially invites you to an exclusive networking event. His law firm had pulled strings to get him on the guest list, a sign that he was moving up in the world. But the moment he stepped inside, he knew. He wasn't really welcome. The stares were subtle, glances held just a second too long, whispers spoken behind manicured hands, the way a server hesitated before handing him a drink. as if unsure whether he was a guest or staff. David had spent his entire career pushing through rooms like this, proving he belonged. But tonight, something felt different. As he made his way toward the bar, a voice stopped him. "Didn't expect to see someone like you here." David turned. A man in his 60s, silver-habled and broad-shouldered, leaned against the marble counter, swirling whiskey in a crystal glass. His suit was flawless, his tie knotted with precision. David knew who he was before he even spoke. Senator Richard Langston. The name alone carried weight. Old money. Old power. David smiled politely. "Good evening, Senator." Langston studied him for a moment before taking a slow sip of his drink. "Carter, right? Lawyer. Made quite the name for yourself." "Doing my best," David said. Langston smirked. "That's good. Always good to see someone work their way up." There was something about the way he said it, like David had clawed his way out of the gutter and was lucky to be here. David kept his expression neutral. "Appreciate that, Senator." Langston set his drink down, folding his hands over the bar. "I imagine it wasn't easy for you getting where you are." "It wasn't," David admitted. Langston nodded slowly. "And yet, here you are." Something about the way he said it made David's stomach turn. Langston lifted his glass again, but this time he didn't drink. Just let the whiskey swirl as he watched David with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said, "my father always told me something about people like you." David felt the shift in the air, the weight of something coming. Langston smiled. "You can dress them up, educate them, even put them in a boardroom, but at the end of the day, they'll never be one of us." The words were spoken so smoothly, so casually, that for a second David wondered if he had misheard. He hadn't. Silence stretched between them. David exhaled slowly, setting his drink down. His fingers curled into his palm, but he didn't let himself react. He had heard things like this before, felt the sting of subtle slights, the way doors closed just before he reached them, but never this blatant. Not here, not to his face. Langston watched him, waiting. David met his gaze and smiled. "That's funny," he said, "because my father told me something too." Langston raised an eyebrow. David leaned in slightly. "He told me that men like you think the world still belongs to them, that the rules haven't changed. But they have, Senator." Langston's expression flickered, just for a second. David straightened, adjusting his jacket. "You're right about one thing, though." Langston tilted his head. "Ooh. Oh." David smirked. "I'll never be one of you." Then he turned and walked away. The night moved on, but the moment lingered. And David knew he wasn't done with Senator Langston yet, because men like that, they always left something to expose. David Carter had spent his entire career playing by the rules. He had fought his way through law school, clerked for a federal judge, and built a reputation as a sharp, unshakable attorney. He had stood in boardrooms filled with men who didn't believe he belonged, shaken hands with politicians who only saw his value when it benefited them. But tonight, as he stood outside the grand ballroom of the Heritage Club, he knew something had changed. After his last encounter with Senator Richard Langston, David had expected retaliation. Langston was the kind of man who didn't take well to being embarrassed, especially not in public. And yet, here he was, invited back. The invitation had come in a sleek black envelope slipped under his office door, no sender, no note, just the words, "Private gathering, members only." It should have been a red flag, but David wasn't one to back down. As he adjusted the cufflinks on his tailored navy suit, he caught his reflection in the polished glass doors. He looked calm, collected, but inside, something churned. He wasn't here just to attend. He was here to expose something. The ballroom was different from the last event. There were fewer people, but the ones who were present carried an unmistakable air of power. CEOs, judges, old money heirs, men who dictated the country's direction behind closed doors. And in the center of them stood Senator Langston. David didn't hesitate. He walked straight toward the bar, ordering a bourbon neat. He didn't have to wait long before Langston noticed him. "Well, well," Langston said, stepping up beside him. "I didn't think you'd come back." David turned, smiling smoothly. "Wouldn't miss it." Langston chuckled, sipping his drink. "You're persistent, I'll give you that." David kept his expression neutral. "And you don't like things you can't control." Langston smirked. "Control is an illusion. Influence, that's the real currency." David knew better than to take the bait. Instead, he scanned the room. Several men were watching them, their conversations hushed. Something was happening here, and David intended to find out what. An hour later, after the bourbon had burned down to nothing but ice, David found himself being led through a side door deeper into the club. Winston walked ahead of him, flanked by two other men, one of them a judge, the other a defense contractor David recognized from the news. "This is where the real business happens," Langston said as they entered a dimly lit chamber lined with bookshelves and old oil paintings. A long mahogany table sat in the center, leather-bound documents stacked neatly beside crystal decanters of whiskey. David's gut tightened. This wasn't just an exclusive club. It was something more. "This is where men like us shape the future," Langston continued. "Decisions happen here before they ever make it to a vote. Policies are written before the public even hears about them." David folded his arms. "And where do I fit into this?" Langston smiled. "You're ambitious, smart, connected, and frankly, Carter, we need someone like you." David narrowed his eyes. "Need me for what?" Langston took a slow sip of his drink. "For cover." The words were a knife in the dark. David forced himself to remain still. "Cover? For what?" Langston tilted his head. "You're sharp. You already know." David didn't know, and he knew he was standing in the middle of something dangerous. For the next 30 minutes, he listened as Langston and his men spoke in careful, calculated words. About policies that were never meant to pass, about laws rewritten to protect their interests, about judges swayed by hidden incentives. They spoke of funds shifted offshore, of backroom deals that ensured their power remained untouched. And then Langston leaned in, his eyes glinting. "You could be a part of this, David." David felt his heart hammer. He had spent his whole life proving that men like Langston were wrong about him, that he wasn't a pawn in their world. But now they were offering him a seat at the table. And if he played his cards right, he could bring them down from the inside. That night, as David left the Heritage Club, his mind was racing. He had recorded everything, the watch on his wrist, custom made with a discreet microphone, had captured every whispered deal, every exchange of power. This was bigger than he had imagined. And it was only the beginning. David Carter knew that once you stepped into the fire, there was no turning back. After the night at the Heritage Club, after hearing the whispered deals and backroom betrayals, he had a choice. Walk away and pretend he hadn't uncovered a conspiracy that could shake the foundations of power, or step deeper into the darkness and bring them down from within. He had already made his decision, and now the real game began. The air in Washington, D.C. was thick with tension. The corridors of power had always been filled with secrets, but David now carried one that could burn it all down. For the past month, he had played his part perfectly, attending meetings, shaking hands, accepting invitations to private dinners where men in $1,000 suits discussed the fate of millions over glasses of aged whiskey. But behind the charm and the carefully crafted smiles, he had been building his case. He had files now, real evidence, and he knew exactly what he was going to do with it. One evening, as David left a fundraiser at a 5-star hotel, he felt the first sign that his cover was slipping. A black SUV idled across the street, its tinted windows too dark to see inside. David didn't slow his pace, but his instincts screamed that he was being watched. He followed it. As he turned the corner onto a quieter street, a figure stepped out of the shadows. Agent Rebecca Holt. VI. David had expected them to show up sooner or later. He kept walking, but Rebecca matched his pace. "We need to talk," she said. David didn't break stride. "I don't talk to feds. You might want to reconsider," she said, lowering her voice, "because if you don't, you won't live long enough to finish whatever game you're playing." "Ha!" David stopped, just for a second. That was enough for Rebecca to know she had his attention. She handed him a USB drive, her expression tight. "Everything we have on Langston, and everything we know about you." David took the drive, sliding it into his pocket. "And what do you want in return?" Rebecca didn't blink. "The same thing you do?" Inside his apartment, David plugged in the USB drive and opened the files. His blood ran cold. Lank's corruption went deeper than he thought. There were records of rigged court cases, manipulated elections, entire communities targeted through economic policies designed to keep power in the hands of a few. And worse, people who had gotten too close to exposing the truth had disappeared. This wasn't just about money and influence anymore. This was about life. The next time David met Langston, he sat across from him at an exclusive restaurant, drinking scotch, while the senator smirked across the table. "You've been busy," Langston said, swirling his drink. David met his gaze evenly. "I like to stay productive." Langston leaned in. "Then let me be clear. You're in, but if you step out of line, you won't be walking away." David smiled. Understood. But what Langston didn't know was that the walls were already closing in on him. David had already set things in motion. The next move belonged to him. And by the time Langston realized it, it would be too late. James Carter had spent his entire life in the small town of Grey Ridge, a place where time seemed to move slower than anywhere else in America. The town was old, older than the cracked brick buildings that lined the main street, older than the rusted train tracks that once carried passengers before the rail line was abandoned. It was a place where history clung to the air like dust, where the weight of the past pressed against the present, refusing to let go. And James, a black man born and raised in this town, knew better than anyone that some histories refused to die. His father had always told him to keep his head down, to be careful, to avoid drawing too much attention. "This town wasn't built for us," his father had said one night, after coming home with bruised knuckles and a silent rage burning in his eyes. James had been just a boy then, too young to understand. But now, at 28, he understood all too well. James was a mechanic, one of the best in town. He had a small garage on the edge of town where he fixed cars for anyone who needed it. He didn't care who they were, what they looked like. If they had a car that needed fixing, he was their guy. But no matter how good he was, there were always people who refused to trust him, who would drive 30 miles to the next town over just to avoid having a black man work on their car. Still, he stayed. Not because he loved Grey Ridge, but because it was home. It was a warm evening when it happened. The air was thick with the scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen, the sky tinged with the deep blues and purples of twilight. James had just closed up his shop and was walking down Main Street when he saw them. 4 white men standing outside the diner, laughing, talking, drinking from brown glass bottles. He recognized them immediately. Ryan Calloway, the mayor's son, Dean Harrison, a deputy at the sheriff's department. The other 2, Clay and Trent, were just local troublemakers. The kind of men who had never worked an honest job in their lives, but carried themselves like they owned the town. James kept his head down and kept walking. "Hey," one of them called. James ignored it. "I said, hey," Ryan repeated. James stopped. He didn't turn around. "You daft boy," Ryan sneered, and James felt his jaw tighten. "Just heading home," James said, keeping his voice even. There was a pause, then the sound of footsteps. They were coming closer. "You don't say hello anymore?" Ryan asked, circling around James so that he was standing directly in front of him. The others flanked him like wolves cornering their prey. James forced a smile. "Evening," he said, nodding once. "Long day, just trying to get home." Ryan smirked, taking a slow sip from his beer bottle before tossing it onto the pavement. The glass shattered at James's feet. "Oops," Ryan said, gritting. "Clumsy me." James glanced down at the broken glass, at the shards glistening in the streetlights. "Clean it up," Ryan said. James let out a slow breath. "It's not my mess." Ryan's smile faltered. "I said, clean it up." James met his gaze then, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then Dean, the deputy, took a step forward, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. James had seen this play out before, not just in Grey Ridge, but in stories passed down from his father, his grandfather. He knew how it ended. He bent down, picking up a piece of the broken glass, careful not to cut himself. Ryan chuckled. "That's a good boy." James clenched his teeth but said nothing. He picked up another piece, and another. Then something shifted in the air. A voice sharp had come through the tension. "James, Roger?" He turned. It was Grace Thompson, the town librarian, a woman in her 60s who had known James since he was a child. She was standing a few feet away, her hands gripping her purse so tightly that her knuckles were white. "Come on," she said firmly. "Let's go." James hesitated. Ryan and the others were watching him, waiting to see what he would do. Then, slowly, he let the glass fall from his hands. He stood up. Ryan's grin vanished. "You don't walk away from me, boy." James felt his heart pounding, but he kept his feet moving. He walked toward Grace, past Ryan, past Dean, past Clay and Trent. He didn't look back. Grace fell into step beside him. "Thank you," he murmured. "Don't thank me," she said. Just don't let them win." James nodded, his chest tight. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying the moment over and over, the way Ryan had looked at him, the way Dean had rested his hand on his gun, the way Grace had stepped in. And then, at 2:47 a.m., his phone rang. It was an unknown number. He hesitated before answering. "Hello? Silence. Then a whisper. "Get out of..." The line went dead. James sat up, his pulse racing. He didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, his garage was on fire. By the time he got there, the flames had already consumed most of the building. Firefighters were working to put it out, but James knew it was too late. His tools, his equipment, everything he had built, it was all gone. He stood there watching the fire burn, his fists clenched at his sides. A police cruiser pulled up. Sheriff Collins stepped out, adjusting his belt as he approached. "Looks like an accident," the sheriff said. James let out a bitter laugh. "Accident." The sheriff shrugged. "Nothing we can do. Best you move on, James. Some folks don't want you here." James turned, meeting the sheriff's gaze. "I was born here." The sheriff sighed. "Yeah, but maybe it's time to go." James felt something in his chest tighten, but he didn't let it show. He just nodded, staring at the ruins of his garage. He had spent his whole life in this town. But now Grayridge had made one thing clear. It wasn't home. Not anymore. James Carter stood in the doorway of his burned-down garage, the scent of charred metal and melted rubber still heavy in the air. It had been 2 weeks since the fire. 2 weeks since the sheriff had all but told him to leave town. 2 weeks since he had answered that phone call at 2:47 a.m., the voice whispering, "Get out of town." But James was still here. The fire had taken everything, but James wasn't ready to let Grayridge Hollow win. He had built something here, and he wasn't going to walk away just because some coward with a match wanted him gone. That's what they expected. That's what they wanted. Instead, James took what little money he had left, borrowed some from Grace Thompson, who refused to let him refuse her help, and rented a temporary workspace on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, just an old gas station that had been abandoned for years, but it had a roof and a lift. It would do. He had just started setting up when the first visitor came. Ryan Calloway. James knew it was only a matter of time. Ryan strolled in like he owned the place, his boots clicking against the concrete floor, his smirk as lazy and arrogant as ever. "Didn't think you'd stick around," Ryan said, running a hand over a dusty counter. "Figured you'd take the hint." James didn't look up from the wrench in his hand. "Figured you'd be too much of a coward to show your face." Ryan's smirk faltered for just a second before he let out a chuckle. "Man, you just don't learn, do you?" James finally looked up. "No, I don't." Ryan sighed, shaking his head. "You don't belong here, Carter. Never have. My old man says I shouldn't waste my time with you, but me? I like to finish what I start." James gripped the wrench tighter, but he didn't move, didn't rise to the bait. "Then maybe your old man's smarter than you." Ryan's smile vanished. The silence between them stretched. Then Ryan leaned in, lowering his voice. "You want to die here, Carter? 'Cause that's where this is headed." James didn't flinch. "If that's what it takes." Ryan stared at him, eyes narrowing, then, without another word, he turned and walked out. James let out a slow breath. That was the first warning. The second came the next morning. James arrived at his shop early, expecting trouble. Sure enough, the side of the building had been tagged with spray paint. "Leave." He shook his head. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to intimidate him. it wouldn't be the last. But it was the third warning that told James this was different. That night he was driving home when he saw the headlights behind him. Too close. Too fast. James barely had time to react before the truck slammed into his back bumper, sending his car skidding. He fought for control, tires screeching against the pavement. Then another hit. Harder. He was being run off the road. James gritted his teeth, gripping the wheel as he veered onto the shoulder, the truck roaring past him before skidding to a stop ahead, blocking the road. 2 doors opened. Ryan, Dean Harrison. James exhaled through his nose, fingers flexing against the wheel. He could run. Back up. Drive away. But he was done running. James got out of the car. Ryan tilted his head. Still here? James rolled his shoulders. Told you, I don't scare easy. Dean leaned against the truck, hand resting on his belt. That's a problem. James took a step forward. Then fix it. Ryan grinned. Gladly. Then he swung. James ducked. Ryan's fist sailed past his head, and James countered with a punch to the ribs. Ryan staggered back, gasping. Demote. James turned, too late. Something hard crashed into the back of his head. And then, darkness. James woke to the sound of water dripping. His head throbbed, his wrists ached. He was tied to a chair. It took him a second to process where he was. A barn. The old Miller farm. He recognized the scent of dust and hay, the faint rust of abandoned machinery. Then he saw them. Ryan, Dean, and Clay, and Trent. While watching him, Ryan leaned forward. You made this a lot harder than it needed to be. James licked his lips, tasting blood. Good, Ryan sighed. I tried to be nice, Carter. Gave you plenty of chances. But you just won't leave. James met his gaze. Not my problem. Brian's smile was thin. It is now. Dean pulled something from his jacket. A knife. James inhaled through his nose. Here's how this goes, Ryan continued. You will leave, you will get in your car, drive out of town, and you will never come back. And if I don't? James asked. Ryan's smile widened. Then we make sure you don't have a choice. Dean stepped closer, flipping the knife in his hand. James braced himself. Then, a sudden, footsteps. Someone was coming. Ryan's head snapped toward the barn door. Dean hesitated. Then, bang, a gunshot. James flinched. Ryan cursed. Dean turned, just as the door burst open. Grace Thompson. And she wasn't alone. Behind her stood half the town. People James had known his whole life, people who had been silent, who had looked away. Not anymore. Grace stepped forward, her eyes burning. Untie him. Ryan's mouth opened, then closed. Grace raised a shotgun. I said, untie him. Clay moved first, scrambling back. Trent followed. Dean hesitated. Then, slowly, he cut the rope. James flexed his hands, shaking out the numbness. He stood, towering over Ryan. Ryan stared at him. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away. Dean followed. Clay and Trent ran. James exhaled. Grace lowered the shotgun. You okay? James nodded. She gave him a long look. You're not leaving, are you? James looked around. At the barn. At the people standing with him. At his tower. No, he said. I'm not. Grace smiled. Good. The next morning, James Carter walked into town with his head high. Gravit had tried to break him. It had failed. Ryan Calloway and his boys were gone. Sheriff Collins had no choice but to investigate after half the town demanded it. And James? James opened his garage. Again, only this time he wasn't alone. Because now, Grayridge belonged to him, too.